Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to continue hearing evidence from Dr. Cohen Hatton. So I'm going to ask Dr. Cohen Hatton to come back in, please. Good morning, Dr. Cohen Hatton. Yes, please sit down.
Good morning.
All right, ready to carry on?
Sure.
Giving your evidence. Thank you very much. Yes, Mr.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, good morning. Good morning, members of the panel, and good morning to you, Dr. Cohen Hatton. Now, yesterday we were just about to go to what was or what is the decision control process, and I'd like to go to that now. Can we please start with your witness statement, please? LFB 00110660, page 7, paragraph 28. You will see there it says this, and I'll just read this to you. The DCP, decision control process, was developed to recognise both the analytical and intuitive processes of the human brain. Decision controls were developed for incident commanders to enable them to focus responses on operational goals, to encourage them to push their situational awareness up to the highest level, and consciously consider the potential consequences of these actions, and to explicitly ensure that the benefit of a decision outweighed the risk. These techniques are designed to minimise the potential for unexpected consequences that might occur when decisions are made intuitively. Furthermore, our research showed the decision control process didn't slow down decision-making. It recognised and supported intuitive decisions in a way that protected against decision traps, where previous decision models had failed to do so. This is also an important consideration to assist with learning when scrutinising a decision post-incident, as the different decision types, analytical and intuitive, lead to different decision-making considerations and behaviours. Now, I just want to break that up a little bit and see where we go. Am I right? The decision control process is the process that was developed specifically as a result of the findings of your research on incident command decision making.
That's correct.
In the tests that we saw.
That's correct.
Right. And first, is it right that in summary, as I understand it, is this correct? The decision control process became a fundamental part of the National Operational Guidance on Incident Command, which was under development at the time you were doing your research.
Yes, that's correct.
Right. And it became so via the CFOA document, The Future of Incident Command, August 2015, we saw yesterday.
No, it became so through the publication of the National Operational Guidance for Incident Command itself.
The previous month?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Now, you've also set out in the passage I've just read out for everybody's benefit that the advantage of the decision control process, or DCP, is that it accurately reflects part of how decisions are made in practice on the incident ground. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And it seeks to strengthen that process by guarding against the dangers of what you call decision traps.
Yes.
And we looked at certain kinds of decision trap yesterday.
Yes.
So would it be right to say that the decision control process seeks to provide a solution to your findings in your tests that commanders are typically not thinking through in a logical order the possible consequences of their chosen course of action?
Yes, it was designed as a tool to support that, yes.
To support, not to provide a solution, but to support the process of making them think through in a logical order.
Yes, that's correct. I worry that it would be an oversimplification to say that it would be the solution to. The solution would suggest that it was a panacea that would be able to, in a sense, ensure that every decision was made in an optimal way. I think decision making can be slightly more complicated than that. The intention of the decision control process was to be a tool that incident commanders could use, with those techniques specifically being the decision controls that could help to guard against some of those decision traps.
Let's look at the 2015 edition of the National Guidance Programme's document, Foundation for Incident Command. It's at SMC 6045. Now, Am I right in thinking that this is one of the parts of the national operation guidance to which you yourself contributed?
Yes, that's correct.
How does it relate to the NOG document, the Future of Incident Command of August 2015 we looked at yesterday?
They're interconnected documents. So the National Operational Guidance document itself was intended to be aimed at the policymakers to assist a fire and rescue service in developing a policy for Incident Command. The Foundation for Incident Command provided additional evidence that expanded on some of the points that would be necessary to develop a policy to help a wider audience, such as trainers and incident commanders themselves. So it was a supporting document. They were interconnected.
Right, I see. And this document, am I right, summarises the decision control process?
It does, as does the National Operational Guidance document at the time.
Yes.
It was reflected in both.
Sorry,
it was reflected in both.
It was reflected in both, yes. Let's look at page 12 of this document. And let's look at the left-hand column where you'll see, if we can have those expanded a bit, some red bullet points under the big heading Decision Control Process, DCP. And it says in the italics in the third paragraph there, the decision control process consists of 4 stages. And then you have 4 bullet points. The first, situation, consists of incident, resource, and risk information gathering. And would it be right to say that that reflects the situational awareness, or SA?
Yes, that's correct. Situation
Right.
assessment.
So that corresponds with the SA stage in the DMM, the
Yes,
decision
it
making
does.
model. Then you've got the second bullet point, plan. This comprises identifying the objectives and tactical priorities and developing a tactical plan. Does that correspond with the PF stage of the DMM, the plan formulation stage?
It does, although it was expanded slightly in the decision control process.
Could you just explain how?
Certainly. In the decision control process itself, if you move across, you'll note the diagram. That might be helpful for me to illustrate.
Yes, I'm going to come to the diagram. We'll look at that.
Sure.
But in answering the question, please use it to illustrate what you want to tell me.
So in essence, in the decision control process, it breaks down the plan formulation stage to the objectives, the tactical priorities and the operational tactics to help the incident commander to consider the steps that might be taken when they're formulating a plan. Right. Whereas in the decision-making model itself, it was more broad. It was
Right.
just objectives.
Can we just have that on the screen more squarely? It's the right-hand side of the page. That's the diagram.
Yes.
Could you just point out in the diagram where you say or how you say the plan formulation stage is expanded under the DCP?
Certainly. It's the bottom right-hand corner, that lozenge.
Right. So plan, which comprises objectives, tactical priorities and operational tactics.
Yes, that's correct.
I see. So there's a correspondence with the plan formulation stage, is this right? But it's broken out into sort of sub-compartments.
Yes.
Right. Then decision controls, if we go back to the left-hand column in the document on page 12, third bullet point, decision controls, applied by asking yourself, why am I taking this action? What are my expectations of these actions? Do the benefits justify the risks? Now, that involves a new element, I think, isn't it? That's introduced by the decision control process.
Yes.
And would it be wrong to summarise that, or in this way, stopping and thinking before deciding?
You may have made the decision, but it's stopping and thinking before you act, which might change the decision.
So it's a review.
Yes.
And
Before
that's
you
new.
action. Yes.
Right. And looking back at the diagram on the right-hand side of the page, please, if we can again, we see. Do we see that in the orange triangle?
Yes, that's correct.
So does it work this way, that you make your plan, but before you act, you go into a stage of decision control, which is in the orange or ochre box, and then into the ochre and blue triangle, where you've got to work through why am I doing this? Expectations, what do I expect to get out of this? Benefits against risk, balancing the two.
That is one way. The other way that you might come to a decision, as we discussed yesterday, would be through a more reflexive or intuitive process. In these boxes, you may go from situation assessment directly to action, which essentially was plan formulation. So the decision controls are intended to be that opportunity to pause and run through that very rapid mental checklist. Once you've made a decision, whether analytically by going situation assessment, plan formulation, plan execution, or whether you've made that more intuitively by situation assessment directly to plan execution, essentially.
I see.
So it recognises both pathways and offers an intervention at the point before you were to execute the decision related with either of those pathways.
Right. And I'd like to come back to that in just a second, but before I do, is it right that the action box, well, let's go back to the bullet points, because there's some text there, right, left-hand side, action, implementing the plan by communicating and controlling actions. And if we look at the diagram on the right now, again, bottom left-hand purple box, communication and control. Does that correspond to the PE stage in the DMM?
It does, yes.
The plan execution stage. Now, can I then come back to what you said a moment ago about this two lines, active monitoring on both sides of the triangle? Does this tell us that you might be a linear thinker, you might be a more intuitive thinker or actor? Either way, before you act, whether you've come to it through a plan or straight from situation assessment, you have to control the decision that you have made by running through the three questions: why, expectations, benefits against risk.
That's correct. The same decision maker may be likely to use different patterns of decision making depending on the position that they might be in the incident. So you may use either an analytical or a intuitive pathway to come to a decision at various points in that incident. The active monitoring lines denote the fact that you could use either pathway, but they also denote the fact that you should actively be monitoring the situation, whereas in the decision-making model, you'll recall that there was an evaluation triangle that waited until the end of the process and then took you back to the beginning. This is intended to reflect the point that incident commanders in particular should constantly be seeking information that would inform their situational assessment.
Rather than encouraging incident commanders to wait until the end and then seeing how it went?
Yes, rather than it being a loop.
Rather than it being a loop. Now, the text of this document may describe better than I can, by way of a question, what it does. Can we go to the bottom two paragraphs on the same page on the left-hand side of this document? There's some text, and what it says is this: under some circumstances, decision makers will respond rapidly and directly to an element of the situation, moving from situation assessment to action. This may be particularly likely where a cue or cues prompts an intuitive decision. The decision control process takes account of the way people naturally make rapid decisions. It presents some safeguards against potential decision traps. See decision traps. It also accounts for the slower and more reflective analytical type decision processes where plans are explicitly formulated. The way an individual will make a decision may not be consciously selected. It depends on a number of factors related to the incident, time pressures, perceived and actual, and the command role adopted. For instance, a senior commander planning the resolution of a large-scale incident may be more likely to reach a decision using an analytical process. A commander who is first in attendance at a house fire where people need urgent rescue is less likely to use this type of process and more likely to use intuitive decision-making. I'd like to come... before I come back to the questions about that text, can I just ask you this? As a result of your research, did you find that as a result of the LFB hierarchy, the line of promotions, a watch manager will be mostly experienced in the physical engagement at an incident, putting out the fire, rescuing people, or assisting with evacuation, whereas senior commanders may have left that experience behind longer ago, and therefore there'd be a tendency in more senior commanders to proceed along the linear route, but a greater tendency among junior incident commanders to proceed from SA to PE.
It can very much depend on the situation and the role that you're doing at the time, that particular incident. There would be more cause for a watch manager that is dealing with the very early stages of an incident, particularly an incident that's very dynamic, like a fire, for example, to use more of those intuitive processes, yes. There might be incidents that are slower moving, for example, a road traffic collision where it's not going to get any worse, it's as bad as it's going to get, so you don't have the same time pressures that you might do at an escalating incident. So the reason I say that is I don't want to make it overly simplistic. It is very nuanced and will depend on the situation, and both will use both processes. But if your question is, would a watch manager be more likely to be using intuitive processes than the kind of situation a more senior commander might find themselves in with more time, then yes, that would be correct.
Yes, thank you. That's interesting. Now, we've seen the explanatory diagram on the right-hand side of the page, and you've explained that. Would it be right to say that decision controls really act as a safeguard against the fact that a decision maker may not have reflected fully on the potential consequences of a chosen course of action?
Yes.
Yes. So this inserts a new, conscious, active thinking, reflective stage before the taking of the action, the final taking of the action based on the decision.
Yes, that's correct.
Right. Can we look at the more detailed guidance on this stage of the process on page 13 of this document? Right-hand column under the heading Decision Controls. And that says decision controls are designed to guard against decision traps that might occur as a result of the type of decision process people naturally adopt in a situation. Before moving to the action phase, decision makers should use decision controls. They can do this as a fast mental check or use them as part of a briefing. Now, the decision control checks are then listed in bullet and sub-bullets, and we saw this in the triangle. Why am I doing this? Goals and objectives. What do I think will happen? Is the benefit proportional to the risk? And it goes on to say, in the paragraph immediately below the bullet points, decision makers should make good, fast use of decision controls at incidents where risks are high and time is short. This means they need to practice using decision controls until they are second nature. The best way to practice is for decision makers to use decision controls at all types of incident. Repeated use will make them more effective. Now, just looking at those two last sentences, am I right that that suggests that decision controls should become, maybe this is the wrong word, but intuitive through repeated use of them?
In a manner of speaking, yes, it should be second nature to use the decision controls, but of course the process that you would be doing wouldn't be intuitive, it would be more thoughtful.
Right. I'm just trying to understand the difference between intuitive and second nature.
Sorry, perhaps it was an unuseful, it wasn't a useful analogy. I think what I'm trying to say is using them should become second nature to you. You should be primed and ready to use them. Using the decision controls themselves would be conscious. You'd be consciously asking yourself, for that particular situation, what am I trying to achieve and how does the action I'm about to take lead me to that? You should be consciously asking yourself how that incident is likely to escalate. What do I anticipate is going to happen? So those prompts that you're using, whilst using the prompt should be something that you would do almost automatically. If you've used it repeatedly, you're going through a thought process that is conscious in comparison to when we were talking yesterday about intuitive decisions and things that might be triggered by a cue. The process that you would go through for that might not include plan formulation because it's an association between a cue and an outcome, for example.
Right. I think what I'm having difficulty with is the difference between intuitive and second nature to the point of automatic. If something is automatic because it's been drummed into you, why is that not intuitive?
Well, it is, but I think what I'm trying to say is the process that you would then go through. It might be an intuitive thing to use the decision controls because it's become second nature, but the process that you would be going through by using the decision controls is thoughtful.
I see. So it would become intuitive to become conscious of the decision controls you're about to use?
Essentially, yes.
Right. I think, yes. So does that mean that it's essential to include them as part of incident command training?
training and policy, and I would also suggest that it would be useful to embed decision controls in other aspects of the organisation as well. So, for example, when you're debriefing an incident, it would be useful to use the decision controls to explore that decision making. It would be useful as part of an operational assurance process for officers to use the decision controls when discussing the incident with those incident commanders at the time. So they become something that's not just incumbent on the incident commander to think about at that point in time. They're more embedded, which helps them become more of it essentially helps them to be more second nature, because you're used to describing what you're doing through those decision controls.
I see what you mean. So when you're being interviewed, for example, as part of a PRO or PRC, you would be able to articulate more precisely the conscious processes of control of the decision you'd made before acting to assist those evaluating your performance.
Yes, precisely. One of the issues when you're using an intuitive process, whether recognition primed or more associative, is you can't very often describe your rationale for that decision at the time because it wasn't consciously planned. And so by using the decision controls before you've made that decision, you're essentially pushing yourself back to that plan formulation piece so that you are conscious about the rationale for the decision that you're about to action before you've taken it.
Yes, I see. Now, where there's a monitoring officer present, which I think at the time of the Grenfell Tower fire was at a 4 pumps plus fire, would the monitoring officer's role also to ensure that where the National Operational Guidance was applied, of course, that the decision control process was actually used by the incident commander?
The National Operational Guidance is silent on the role of the monitoring officer, but and not all fire and rescue services have monitoring officers, but it would be reasonable where a monitoring officer does exist to suggest that part of their role would be to ensure that the guidance is being used appropriately.
How would they do that?
They would do that by essentially speaking to the incident commander about the decisions that they're making. They would be observing briefings that the incident commander might be giving. So they would be able to see whether they're using those decision controls because they would be articulating them, and they may challenge the incident commander's decisions through the use of the decision controls. So it might be a conversation such as the monitoring officer may see a decision that the incident commander is about to make, and they would ask them, so why are you doing that? Where is that linking in terms of your plan, in terms of your objectives? What do you think is going to happen? Let's talk through the implications of that and tell me how the benefit is proportional to the risk. That would be a slower time use, but one way in which an observer in some capacity might be able to use the decision controls to be able to assure themselves that they're being applied appropriately to a decision that's about to be taken.
In reality, would that happen whether or not the monitoring officer was challenging the incident commander's decision and proposed course of action, or would it happen in any event?
In terms of the monitoring officer themselves or the incident commander?
In terms of the monitoring officer themselves. Let me put the question a bit slightly differently.
Please.
Would the discussion that you just identified happen only where the monitoring officer thought that the acting on the decision was not appropriate, or would it happen in any event?
It should happen in any event.
Right. Can I ask you about handovers?
Certainly.
Because would I be right in thinking that at an incident command handover, and I know there's policy which covers this, the incoming incident commander, is this right, would go through the decisions which have been acted on by the incident commander who is handing over control and run through each process?
In London, the process would be to use the decision-making model as a briefing tool. So
Yes.
at the handover point, they would run through the incident information, the resource information relevant to the incident at that point in time, and also any hazards or risks that might still be present. Then they would attempt to articulate their plan for the overarching incident, and then in terms of communication and control communication, they would normally run through process. So the use of radio channels, for example, there is less discussion around control, but they would also then talk about the incident structure themselves. So it would be through using the decision-making model itself. They would only run through individual decisions if it was particularly salient or particularly relevant, rather than running back through a history of all of the decisions that have been made.
Well, that's in London, but in the way in which this policy was intended to operate, my question is, at handover, was it intended that at handover the incoming incident commander should run through the decision control processes which have been used by the outgoing incident commander?
The National Operational Guidance is silent on the use of briefing tools.
Yes.
We weren't prescriptive to Fire and Rescue Services in a specific briefing tool that they should use. However, the decision control process is one tool that they could use to articulate the irrelevant information during a handover, but it doesn't explicitly say that.
Why was that?
Because there are a number of briefing tools that Fire and Rescue Services use as well. There are a number of mnemonics that essentially set out some criteria for Fire and Rescue Services to use, and the intention wasn't necessarily to be prescriptive on that, although some work has been done subsequently through national working groups to look at whether there could be a more prototype example of a briefing tool that could be used.
I'm just trying to work out the thinking in policy terms of not, you say prescribing, but not at least suggesting that the DCP should be used at handover and leaving it to the DMM in London.
It was discussed when we were developing the guidance, but I think because a number of Fire and Rescue Services were using other tools and a variety of tools, then it wasn't something that the group had decided to prescribe in policy at that point in time.
Was that a gap, do you think?
Potentially. It is something that we'd worked on since. The Incident Command Guidance was the first piece of national operational guidance that was developed, so there was a lot of discussion on what should be policy and what should be prescribed and what wouldn't count as policy. The briefing tool arguably was more of a grey area, but as I said, it is something that some work has been done with since.
Now, I want to ask you next about the research that you did during your secondment to the CFOA, the Chief Fire Officers Association. After you were seconded, you told us that you'd carried out a second piece of research on the topic we've been discussing. And you described that in paragraph 29 of your witness statement as, and I'll quote it to you, national decision trials exploring the effectiveness of the DCP compared with the DMM. It's paragraph 29 for those who want to look at it. Would it be right to summarise the purpose of that second piece of work as being to establish the effectiveness of training that was specifically based on the DCP, the decision control process, rather than the normative decision-making model, the DMM?
In essence, yes, we wanted to look at how effective the decision control process was itself, primarily because it was important to us that it was going to be practical for incident commanders to use. So the point of the research was to test the efficacy of the decision control process itself.
Right. And did that include the question whether the training it did in fact successfully encourage explicit plan formulation, inserting the decision control stage, rather than the tendency that you'd observed to move directly from situation awareness to plan execution?
Yes, it did.
Right. And is it right that the findings of that research were again published, this time in the Journal of Experimental Psychology in November 2015?
Yes.
Yes. Now, let's have that on the screen, just to remind ourselves of it. It's at LFB 00110 and you are the co-author with, is it Mr. Honey?
Professor Honey.
Professor Honey. And you, I wonder if we can summarise the research that you carried out in this way, and tell me if you disagree with anything here. You used, I think, a threefold set of scenarios, so a house fire, a road traffic collision, and a fire in a skip, and then replicated those three scenarios across three different forms of training.
Yes, the skip fire was slightly more complicated than just a skip, in as much as it spread to a nearby residential building and a shop as well. But yes, in essence.
Yes. Yes, I can see why a fire contained in a skip wouldn't tell one much. Now, experiment 1, am I right? Experiment 1 used a visual virtual reality environment.
Yes.
Experiment 2 used simulated incidents on the fire ground.
Yes.
Using the Fire Service College, I think.
Yes.
And experiment number 3, a house fire recreated as what I think you called a live burn.
Yes, that's correct.
And am I right that you used 84 experienced incident commanders for each one of those experiments?
84 incident commanders in total.
Oh, in
who
total, right.
Each undertook the 3 scenarios, but only one of the incident commanders would have, each incident commander would have only done one phase of the experiment. So we had a separate group that did the virtual reality element. We had a separate group that then did the training ground section, and then a separate group of incident commanders that did the live burns.
Right, so 3 groups totaling 84.
Correct.
Right, and were they distributed randomly?
Yes, they were. The entire experiment was counterbalanced completely.
Right, I see. Now, is it right also that shortly before each experiment, the commanders were split into 2 groups, a standard group and a decision group?
Yes.
So is it right that the standard group would be a control?
Yes, they were using the decision-making model as in extant guidance at the time.
And then each group, I think, received an hour's training that either mirrored the DMM, the standard guidance about how decisions are made, so the normative approach, or else mirrored the DCP.
Yes, that's correct.
And that, I think, was called goal-orientated in the article.
Yes, that's correct.
Standard training, would that be the LFB's standard training on the decision-making model?
It wasn't based on the training given by any particular fire and rescue service. If I could illustrate the content of the training, that might be helpful to the inquiry.
Yes, please do.
For example, in the decision-making model group, they had initially some input on the decision-making model itself to remind them about the components of the decision-making model and how it's used. And then for the decision control group, they would have had similarly input on the decision control process and its components and how it's used. And then each group would have gone on to watch a video of an incident broken down in particular sections, and it would pause at a point, and for the standard group they would be asked what they would do next. They would be using the decision-making model as their tool, whereas with the decision control group, the decision group, they would be prompted to use the decision controls to say what they were going to do next, why, what they expected to happen, and how the benefit outweighed the risk. So they were prompted to use the decision controls in practice.
Can I just see if I can understand one aspect of your answer? You say in the decision-making model group, they had initially some input on the decision-making model itself to remind them about the components of the decision-making model and how it's used. Does that mean that they were taught that rather than giving the input? In other words, they received the input?
Yes.
I see. Can you explain why do it that way rather than simply taking your standard group and giving them a standard training that a fire and rescue service would give them? LFB being a prime example, where we know there is incident command training, which involves training on the decision-making model.
It was important that that group was operating as a control group. So whatever input that we were providing, the control group, it was important that it mirrored the training that we were going to give in the experimental group, which in this case was the decision group. So one of the things that was very important to us was that both would receive input. If you were to have a training session on the decision-making model in a fire and rescue service, it might be a component of a broader lecture. They might look at it as part of pre-course learning. So it would be difficult to standardise an approach to that and also do it in a way that was going to effectively mirror what you were going to do in the control group, so that it was important to ascertain that the effects that you were seeing were as a result of the thing that you were trying to manipulate, not something erroneous as a difference that might have been in the training delivered.
I understand that. Was there a countervailing risk, though, that by designing specific decision-making model training for the standard group, by reference to, perhaps, the training for the decision control process, there was a risk that unconscious bias might creep into the DMM training?
Not necessarily, because the control group itself would have already been established on the use of the decision-making model. They would be used to using it anyway as a piece of extant guidance. The decision group itself was given something different. Sorry, I'm not sure I followed your question, actually.
Well, by designing specific training for the standard group on the decision-making model for specific use as part of this experiment, rather than simply using or packaging up the training done in real life, as it were, in London, for example, was there a risk that it would contain some kind of unconscious biases to lead the standard group away from having full faith in the DMM?
Oh, I see. Forgive me. No, I don't think so, because we were essentially just providing an articulation of the decision-making model, which was directly lifted from policy,
right, from
the extant policy. So there was nothing that they were experiencing in that training that would have been new, as it were. So they were presented with the same information that you might be presented with on a training course. I think the point I'm trying to make is if you were experiencing training, it might be a broader package that would be linked to other pieces as well.
I see. And you then, I think, followed the same process as you had in your first piece of research, namely that you recorded the commanders during the experiments and then coded the footage either as situational awareness, plan formulation, or plan execution.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. And on the subject of your findings, is it right that in all three experiments, incident commanders who received the standard training demonstrated the same pattern that you'd observed in your earlier research, namely that they would move directly from situational awareness to plan execution rather than plan formulation?
Yes, that's correct. It was a very similar pattern.
Yes, and the incident commanders who received the decision group or the goal-orientated training were more likely, as you found it, to demonstrate plan formulation rather than plan execution.
Yes.
After situational awareness.
Yes, that's correct.
And am I right also that the incident commanders who received that training, the goal-orientated training, and showed a greater tendency towards plan formulation, didn't spend any more time in making those decisions than the standard group?
Yes, that's correct. We measured the latency between some injects that represented unexpected events, such as water unexpectedly failing. We measured the latency between the time that the inject was given and the time at which an action was taken. And there was no significant difference between the groups that were using the decision control process and the groups that were using the decision-making model.
Right. What is latency?
The time between.
Okay. Time lag.
The time lag, yes.
Right. Does that support, well, did you find that it did support your conclusion that following the decision control process does not reduce a commander's ability to respond quickly on the fire ground to events?
Yes, that was the summation of the evidence that we found.
Yes. So could you summarise for us in practical terms what your concerns would be as a result of this work about relying on the same standard command training that was used in this research that would reflect the traditional normative model?
Yes. In essence, what we found when people were using the normal or the old decision-making model as it was, they were more likely to use intuitive decision-making. In this particular piece of research, I recall it was around 70% of the time in total, as opposed to the 80% of the time that we found at real-life incidents, but it was similar. They were more likely to rely on intuitive decision-making without something that would stop them and help them to make sure that the particular individual decisions that they were making were related to the overarching goal of the incident. We also found when they were using the decision-making model that they were making decisions that were based pretty much on the here and now. It was a lower level of situational awareness. When we saw commanders using the decision control process, what we saw was an increased use of goal-directed behaviour. So they were more likely to link the decision that they were making to the overarching goal of the incident, what they were trying to achieve. The reason that is important, I articulated in my evidence yesterday that when you are just responding intuitively, you're responding to a piece of the incident, one part of it. And when you're responding intuitively, it feels very much like instinct, like a gut feeling that this is the right thing to do. That might absolutely be the right thing to do based on that single cue. But when you put that cue back into the bigger picture of the overarching incident, that's when you may have unintended consequences. So by using the decision controls, what we found were incident commanders considering the cue that they might be experiencing within that broader context of the incident. And we also saw a greater degree of anticipation. It was a higher level of situational awareness that we were seeing from those incident commanders. So they weren't just thinking about what they needed to do at that moment, they were thinking about the impact of that and the ramifications of that. Within the incident. So my concern with continuing the use of the decision-making model is that we weren't able to provide a tool within the decision-making model that was going to assist those incident commanders with those safeguards, if you like, to support them. And while I accept it would not mean that every decision would be a planful decision and not every decision would be a goal-directed decision, we certainly saw an increase in that. There are some decisions that are helpful to be very reflexive and intuitive, but what we wanted to look at was how we could address that balance to get incident commanders to be more planful, more considered and critically more goal-directed with a greater level of situational awareness.
Could you give us a practical example of how command training might be modified to incorporate the decision control process?
Yes, there would be a change in the input, so it would be a different description of the decision control process, first and foremost, because it would replace the content that was associated with the decision-making model. Descriptives aside, in a practical sense, one of the techniques that was very impactful during the training that we did in the experiment itself was to coach an incident commander in using those decision controls. So to give a scenario, pause at particular points in time and run through those decision controls to prime that decision maker's thinking in terms of those decision controls. So you may have a scenario that an incident commander would be running through and you would freeze the frame, you'd pause at that point in time and you would ask, what are you going to do next? And then you would ask, why are you going to do that? What are you expecting to happen? And articulate to me how the benefits of that action are going to outweigh the risk.
Taking one of those three experiments, the live burn house fire, can you give us an example of at what stage in that incident you would have paused and asked those questions?
As a training scenario?
Yes, as a training.
Yes, as a training scenario. You would do it at a number of times. So when an inject came in, so the example that I gave was water unexpectedly failing, pause at that point and say, what are you going to do? Why are you going to do it? How does the benefit outweigh the risks? And what are you expecting to happen as a result? So you would pause it at that point that a decision is required, but before it's necessarily implemented, to coach that decision maker through those points to help them to understand in practice how they might be applied and the range of scenarios that they might apply, or the range of decisions that they might apply them at.
Right. I mean, from a layman's perspective, one may not know the answer to the question you've just posed, but would that be filled by policy or training? So when water fails, you do X.
It would be, I think, You may do it through both. So there are elements of policy that you will be referring to in your training. But in essence, the description that I gave was more based in training because it's how you would help someone to learn how to do something as opposed to just the technical knowledge of what you should do according to a policy in that scenario.
Right. Can I then turn to another topic, which is the LFB's response to the Incident Command National Operational Guidance and the decision control process? If we go to your witness statement, please, we'll just have it up, but I don't need to read it out to you. Page 8, paragraph 33. You refer there to Group Manager Butler, Phil Butler's literature review that he did in 2014, and we saw that reflected, I think, in the August 2015 Future of Incident Command document yesterday. Do you remember who asked him to perform that review?
Yes, that would have been as part of a work package for the National Operational Guidance Programme itself.
And if we turn the page to page 34, paragraph 9, you referred there to a briefing paper prepared by Group Manager Butler for AC Cotton and DAC Ellis about the draft text to be used to direct Babcock to include or exclude aspects of incident command. Now, that's before I think you joined the LFB, and you explain in paragraph 35 that you had no formal involvement in the production of the note. Is it right that you were nonetheless working with Group Manager Butler at this time on your own research into command decision-making?
I was, yes,
Yeah.
but I wasn't involved in his role in London Fire Brigade at the time.
No, but did Group Manager Butler discuss the briefing paper with you on an informal basis?
Only in as much as there were elements that he thought needed to be introduced into London.
And what did he think should be introduced into London?
Certainly the command skills was a gap, including the decision control process.
And do you know what his view was based on?
The research that we did, and also the National Operational Guidance, which made explicit that the expectation was that fire and rescue services should adopt the National Operational Guidance.
The National Operational Guidance didn't come until 2015, and the review was in 2014.
No, but it was imminent.
I see.
It had been drafted. The publication process was somewhat lengthy. So although it wasn't published, I think off memory, until about June or July 2015, the draft was already in an advanced stage.
Did you have, or were you aware at this time that he was having discussions with Graham Ellis and Danny Cotton about the Incident Command National Operational Guidance?
Not directly.
Right. So, indirectly.
I wasn't.
How indirectly?
I wasn't privy to the content of the discussions, but I knew that as part of his role, he would likely be having those discussions because those were the people that he would be reporting to.
Can we then go to LFB 00110668? This is Group Manager Butler's paper, dated the 15th of December 2014. Its subject is Incident Command Review, and it's a brief, as we can see, for AC Danny Cotton and DAC Graham Ellis. And its purpose, as you can see, is to outline a number of issues concerning the Incident Command Review, and where necessary to provide a number of recommendations to resolve them that require your action, or to recommend the acceptance of a process associated with future development of Incident Command training. Do you know if the Incident Command Review referred to by Group Manager Butler there is the same as the 3-yearly Incident Command training course review, the Incident Command Review course review that Babcock undertook following the start of their contract in 2012?
Yes, that's my understanding. Group Manager Butler was seconded across to Babcock, I believe, at that time.
Yes, and you, I think, sat on the Incident Command Project Board from 2015 after you joined the LFB.
Latterly, yes.
Latterly, and the purpose of that was, am I right, to oversee the review of the Incident Command training specifically?
It was to assist with, as opposed to having direct responsibility for.
Assist with? Now, even though you weren't yet at the LFB as of December 2014, were you aware at that time from Group Manager Butler that the LFB were undergoing a review of their incident command training?
I understood that one was imminent, but I didn't know the content of it. At this point, 15th of December, I would have been told that I was to be appointed to London Fire Brigade, I believe, but I didn't start until the February. I had a notice period to work out.
Yes. As you told us, February is when you started, February 15. Now, this briefing paper sets out a number of recommendations relating to incident command training. And if we go to page 2, we can see subparagraph B, which says this: I recommend that in future Babcock's training reviews that they are directed to, a horizon scan for training solutions adopted by other FRSs and other industries as a fundamental part of their review. This will assist to ensure future training is modern and up to date. I also recommend that where a policy does not exist for an aspect that is critical for incident command, you direct Babcocks to include it for them to develop appropriate training. These critical aspects are, and then he sets out 5 headings: human factors, the decision control method for inclusion in the NOG, operational discretion, changes to tactical modes to be included in the NOG, and GESIP, and the joint decision model. Now, can we just look at Little Roman 1, human factors of incident command, or the command skills to be included in NOG for incident command. Item 2, decision making as opposed to the DMM. And then at Little Roman 2, the decision control method as it is to be included in NOG for incident command. Now, following that briefing paper, you refer, I think, to an email in paragraph 38 of your statement sent by Group Manager Butler to James Dalgleish and Dave Brown, copied to AC Cotton and DAC Graham Ellis on the 1st of April 2015. And let's go to that. It's at LFB 00110664. And there's the email. And I'll just show it to you. It's, as I say, from Phil Butler to James Dalgleish, and you can see the copyees. All, please find below a revised draft text to be used to direct Babcocks to include or exclude those aspects of incident command discussed at our meeting on the 2nd of February. The LFB recognises that at present it is awaiting the production of national guidance before it develops any policies that relate to a number of key features of incident command that will form part of the national operational guidance for incident command. At present, the guidance will not be published before the end of the incident command review. In recognition of this and the importance of the anticipated changes within the national guidance, it is necessary that the incident command training review ought to include the following. And then you can see the first bullet point, command skills, i.e. human factors of incident command. And the second sub-bullet point there is decision-making. See that? And then the second bullet point down, decision control process, i.e. the revised decision-making model, which includes the addition of decision controls and reflects the decision-making methods used by incident commanders. I've shown you that. Now, this is April 2015. So I think during your, I don't know if it'd be right to call it the probationary period, but during your initial phase of your time at the LFB, were you aware that Group Manager Butler had proposed giving this direction to Babcock relating to the need to incorporate the revised decision control process into the review of incident command?
I understood that to be the case, yes.
Now, I want to show you what DAC Ellis says about this in his witness statement. If we go, please, to LFB 00118230, let's go to page 3. This is his statement from May 2020. And at page 3, you can see paragraph 19 at the bottom of the screen. I recall discussing the briefing note with GM Phil Butler, AC Cotton, and other colleagues in December 2014. It was clear that the fundamental changes proposed by, if we just go to the IC, NOG, Incident Command National Operational Guidance, would have far-reaching consequences for the selection, training and assessment of future incident commanders within LFB. It was agreed that consideration of these fundamental changes would require strategic oversight and direction within LFB and full engagement from directors / corporate board. Now, just looking closely on the proposed change from the DMM to the DCP specifically, do you, or perhaps did you agree with DAC Ellis's assessment that this was a fundamental change that would have far-reaching consequences for the selection, training and assessment of future incident commanders within the brigade?
It was certainly a fundamental change within the guidance, and it would have implications. I think my issue is I don't know the extent to which he's referring to far-reaching consequences. So yes, it would have consequences, but I would have difficulty in understanding how he was trying to quantify that with that statement.
Right. So consequences, but not necessarily far-reaching.
It would certainly have consequences. It would certainly involve change in London Fire Brigade, yes.
Can you explain why, or do you know why, Mr. Ellis considered that it was a fundamental change with far-reaching consequences? Why did he use... Do you know why his view was that the changes and the consequences would be so great?
No, that would be a question for Mr. Ellis, I think.
The LFB then, I think, produced a report in July 2015, shortly after the NOG was published. And I'd like to show you that. It's LFB 00110673, please. And it's dated 16th of July 2015. And it's entitled National Operational Guidance Incident Command Provisional Impact Review. And if we go, please, to page 3, under Organisational Impact as the heading, I'll just read you the first 2 paragraphs for the context. The Foundation for Incident Command document predominantly details the qualities and skill requirements for incident commanders and strategic arrangements that need to be implemented regarding selection, development and assessment in order to achieve command competence. The contents of this document will need to be considered as part of the LFB review of command competence. As the author of much of the content and lead for the LFB review, this will be dealt with by DAC Cohen Hatton, Learning and Development, Appendix 1, Item 1. And then if we go, please, to the top of page 4, if you look at the first paragraph, it reads as follows. CFO Simon Pilling. I think it should be Pilling. I think he was at West Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service.
He was.
Yeah. CFO Simon Pilling made it very clear at the Incident Command Conference that the decision control process does not replace the decision-making model, DMM, which will significantly reduce the potential impact of the guidance on LFB as it is mentioned in and the foundation of many policies. The decision control process is an illustration of how incident commanders think and will therefore be a useful tool for selection and development, but should not lead to wholesale changes in the DMM or other policies. However, the decision controls, why, expectations and benefits will be incorporated into the gathering and thinking, deciding area of the DMM policy, Appendix 1, Item 7. Now, Simon Pilling chaired the National Operational Guidance Team's review of Incident Command Guidance, didn't he?
He did.
And do you know what he said at the Incident Command Conference about the DCP model?
Yes, I do. The point that he was trying to make is that the decision control process was an evolution of the decision-making model itself. So it is a fundamental piece of the national operational guidance, but the point that he was trying to make was that it was an evolution that incorporated some aspects of the decision-making model and more helpfully would illustrate how people think as well. What he wasn't suggesting was that it was simply an illustration or a picture, as the paragraph latterly refers to. This was a paragraph that I challenged when this report was circulated.
Going back to the conference, were you at the conference?
I was.
Did you challenge him at the conference on this?
No, because what he was saying was right. It was an evolution of the decision-making model.
I see. So it's this text that you object to?
Yes. Sorry. Yes.
Now, let's just trace this through historically. Can we go to your statement, please? LFB 00110660, page 10, paragraph 40. And you say this. In addition, on the 12th of August 2015, I received an email from Group Manager Lee Drawbridge attaching a report titled National Operational Guidance Incident Command Provisional Impact Review. That's the document we've just looked at.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, I just want to look at the document, the email chain. Can we look at that? It's at LFB 00110678. This is the email chain. Can we start at page 2, please, and look at the email at the bottom of the string, which I think is the email you're referring to. It's from Lee Drawbridge to you and others, dated 12th of August 2015 at 14:08. Is that the email you're referring to?
Yes, it is.
Was that the first time that anyone in the LFB had spoken to you about the action that the LFB proposed to take in response to the National Operational Guidance on this issue?
Yes, it was.
Now, we see your response to that email. If we go to page 1, please, and look at the foot of the page, same day, a few hours later, 17:55, and you can see that it's sent to Lee Drawbridge and a host of others, but also copied to Peter Cowap, Danny Cotton, and Graham Ellis, and indeed Dan Daly. Thanks, Lee. And I just want to show you this. You say this: I just wanted to make a point of clarity around the decision control process and the DMM, as I fear it might be easily misconstrued. Just pausing there, were you referring in that sentence to the paragraph in the report that we've just looked at together?
Yes, I was.
Right. You go on to say this: it was one of the cornerstones of the new guidance, and so I think it's really important that the journey is understood. I appreciate that there may be some resistance to this given the work that has been done around the DMM in London, and I really just want to give some assurances. The point that CFO Pilling, the CFOA lead for command, and the lead of the National Op Guidance for IC was making at the conference was that the DCP is not a new construct, in quotes, that replaces the DMM, rather it is an evolution and an improvement of the DMM. It contains many of the same elements as the DMM, which will mean that there is not necessarily going to be an enormous impact in some respect. However, it is not simply intended to be an illustration of how people think. The point he was trying to make was that the DCP is intended to support commanders and brigades when decisions are scrutinised post-incident by being more representative of how people actually make decisions. Having done expert witness work on behalf of CFOA in relation to incidents involving FF fatalities, I know only too well how both barristers and the HSC will compare actions and statements to the extant guidance and how far away from reality such arguments can be. This was part of the learning that went into the guidance. In the case of the NOG, this will be the exemplar guidance that they go to, and the structure of the DMM did nothing to support, whereas the DCP explicitly aims to do so. Therefore, should we deviate from this, it would undoubtedly leave us in a very vulnerable position should our commander's decisions be scrutinised following an incident. And I'll just read the rest to you. The second part around the decision control technique was that the research commissioned by the CFOA and now published in a peer-reviewed science journal compared the performance of 84 incident commanders, half using the DMM and half using the DCP. We found that the situational awareness of ICs using the DCP was up to 5 times higher than those using the DMM, and they link their actions significantly more to plans and communicate more explicitly. The expectation from CFOA is that brigades will build on the learning from the DMM and work with the evolution of the DCP, and progress will be monitored through the CFOA working groups. It would be great for us to stay ahead of the curve in this respect and lead the way in this evolution, particularly as LFB are the guardians and main funders of the NOG. I'd be happy to present on the work that CFOA commissioned around this in September if it might help the journey. Now, the findings in that penultimate paragraph there is the 84 incident commanders. That's the second piece of research, I think, that we looked at together this morning.
That's right.
With the 3 experiments.
Yes.
Now, by this time, this is mid-August 2015, you'd been employed by the LFB for about 6 months or so.
Yes.
Given your expertise in the area and the fact that you'd conducted this research and had a published article, which we've seen, Did anyone speak to you before this provisional impact report was compiled to seek your opinion on what action the LFB should take?
No.
Did you seek an explanation as to why not?
I spoke to AC Cotton after this email exchange and offered to present the work as just discussed. Ultimately, I was told that the London Fire Brigade didn't intend to depart from the use of the DMM.
Did you ask AC Cotton for an explanation as to why nobody had consulted you on that text?
No, I didn't. I offered to assist. I was conscious that the ownership of incident command wasn't my remit. That would come under her as the head of operational assurance and Graham Ellis as the head of ORT. So I understood that it wasn't within my remit of authority, but I was very happy to assist.
Yes, it's not quite an answer to my question. Let me try and backtrack one. When Lee Drawbridge sent you this report on the 12th of August 2015, did it come out of the blue to you?
It did. I was surprised.
What was your reaction to reading the paragraph that we read together earlier, to which this email is a response?
I was surprised and disappointed, which is why I responded to try to clarify those points. I was concerned that it might have been misinterpreted.
And when you then had your conversation with AC Cotton, did you communicate to her your disappointment?
I did.
In terms that were clear to her, do you think?
I tried to do it gently, perhaps too gently. My intention wasn't to try to challenge anyone's authority over the ownership of the incident command policy in any way, but I hoped that I might be able to assist in some way.
Did you ask her the question, why did nobody consult me about this document?
No, not directly. I said it was a shame that no one had, but I would be happy to help.
Now, going back to the email, we can see that at the top, first email on the first page, that Danny Cotton responds to you on the same day, 2 minutes later. Hi both. I didn't want to include it in the email to all, but the report on the future of Incident Command was approved last week by the Presidential Board and is being published and sent to all CFOs. The Commission is aware. Are the recommendations something we want to consider through this working group? And then at the top of the page, you'll see that there's an email on the same day. We go to the very top. It's at 7:41 p.m. from Danny Cotton to you and to Graham Ellis. I think we need to meet. I think we need to meet to discuss this. I'm back in later next week. Did you have a conversation with Danny Cotton at that point?
I did. That was the discussion I was referring to a moment ago.
Right, I see. And what was the upshot of that discussion?
I was informed ultimately that the Fire Brigade didn't consider that there was sufficient evidence to warrant moving away from the decision-making model.
Yes. Now, you weren't involved in that decision, I think.
No, I was not.
Did Danny Cotton give you any indication as to the reason?
Sorry,
the reason for the decision, not the reason for your non-involvement.
Forgive me. Only that there needed to be enough of a business reason to move away from it to justify the effort of moving away from a policy that you currently have. She also mentioned that she thought it might adversely impact people with neurodiversity such as dyslexia.
Breaking those two up, what did you understand her to mean by business reason?
That there should be sufficient reason to move away from a policy to justify the effort of moving away from it and the disruption that would be caused by moving away from it.
Leaving aside the disruption question, why wasn't the fruits of your research and the results that you had published twice, I think, by then, not enough?
That would have to be a question for AC Cotton. I continued to advocate for the use of the decision control process until I left the London Fire Brigade.
It may be a question for AC Cotton. Did you ask her that question?
Which questions precisely?
Why are the results of my research not a good enough reason to justify the effort moving away from the DMM?
In our discussions, I pointed out that the results of the research were sufficient to move the national picture and for other fire brigades in the Fire and Rescue Service nationally to move across to the decision control process.
Now, Graham Ellis, who, as I've shown you, has provided the inquiry with a statement, has said that the Incident Command National Operational Guidance became, as he put it, a major feature, his words, of Babcock's review of Incident Command training that we've discussed. Now, we've already referred to the fact that you sat on the project board and you assisted in the review by Babcock. Do you remember whether the potential incorporation of the DCP was specifically discussed in that context?
At one of the boards, AC Cotton indicated that although the decision for the London Fire Brigade wasn't to move away from the decision-making model, she was happy for the decision controls to be used by trainers during the training. I did point out at the time that that would be a welcome step, although it wouldn't fully account for the benefits of the decision control process in its entirety.
Right. Just before I come back to the next question arising out of that, you mentioned neurodiversity as a reason given to you by AC Cotton for not adopting the decision control process. Was there any research or empirical basis for that?
Not to the best of my knowledge. My understanding was that she had shown it to a colleague who had dyslexia, who on first presentation of it found it confusing. Right.
Now, Graham Ellis also says that in discussions that he'd had about the DCP with AC Cotton and others, there was, as he puts it, a consensus view that LFB commanders were already being trained to complete these rapid mental checks under the existing DMM. Was that consistent with your understanding of how the LFB's incident commanders were already being trained at the time?
No, it wasn't.
Did you know that there was, if there was, a consensus view as described by DAC Ellis?
I don't know the people for whom he's referring to in that. I've seen nothing either in the decision-making model or the training that would lead me to suggest that they were using the current decision-making model accounted for those decision controls, which was precisely the reason why nationally we changed it and explicitly inserted them.
Can I show you Danny Cotton's witness statement, because she has also provided some evidence on this subject. This is at LFB 00118213, page 7. And if we look at paragraph 31, she says in the last sentence there, in particular, the DCP had not undergone an EIA, and I understand it has not been tested at larger scale incidents with level 3 and level 4 incident commanders. Now, I think it's right that your research had been limited to level 1 and 2 incident commanders.
Yes, that was the main thrust of our focus.
In the discussions at the Brigade concerning the decision controls in which you were involved, did anybody ever raise with you the fact that the DCP had not been tested with higher level commanders?
I'd heard informally that had been discussed, but not directly with me. I should say, in relation to level 3 and level 4 incident commanders, there was a subsequent piece of work done with a working group for JESIP, the Joint Emergency Services Interoperability Principles. And although we didn't conduct a full-scale study in the same way that we did with the decision control process for fire commanders, it was adopted, the decision controls, were adopted in the Joint Emergency Services Interoperability Principles, with the addition of 2 extra decision controls that focused more on group decision making that you might expect, particularly at level 4 incidents, where you are operating in a multi-agency environment, but also in level 3 environments where you may be having decisions that you're making jointly with other agencies.
And when was that?
I'm trying to recall the precise dates. I would be able to find the precise dates for the inquiry. It would have been, I believe, perhaps autumn of 2015 was when the working group was meeting.
Before Grenfell.
Yes, before Grenfell.
Did you consider that the lack of higher level commanders in your research adversely affected the reliability of your findings?
In terms of its generability, I didn't think so, because your level 1 to 3 are all fireground-based incident commanders. So the differences that you're looking at are scale, and in particular with level 3 incident commanders, you may have more cause to have multi-agency decisions that you would be making through tactical coordination groups, for example. Level 4 incident commanders is more strategic, so that's a fair point. However, I do go back to the point that there was sufficient evidence in there to support the GESIP working group with their review of GESIP and to implement the decision controls within that, with those additional decision controls focused on the group decision making, which should have covered that aspect. Although the other point is, of course, for level 4 incident command, when you're operating strategically, you would be using the joint decision model as opposed to the decision control process itself.
Right. That's quite a detailed answer, and I wonder if we can try and just simplify it a little bit. AC Cotton says, and it appears by way of giving a reason for rejecting the inclusion of the DCP in the LFB's training, that it hadn't been tested at larger scale incidents with levels 3 and 4 incident commanders. Do you agree that that's a good reason?
I think that no, because with level 3 incident commanders, it's a very similar activity to levels 1 and 2. The scale would be different. If anything, you would be more likely, as we discussed earlier, to see more instances of analytical decision making as opposed to the more intuitive decision making. But the results were broadly generalisable.
I see. So would you put it this way, and please tell me if you wouldn't, that it's a bad reason because level 3 is the same as levels 1 and 2, but bigger, and level 4 is more strategic, and the elements were covered anyway?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, AC Cotton has also referred to, as you can see here, that the decision control process had not gone an EIA. I think that's an equality rather than an environmental impact assessment.
That's correct.
Yes, and would that mean that it would be inaccessible for individuals with learning difficulties? That's what I think she says in the next paragraph, in paragraph 34.
Yes, I think that's the point that she's trying to make. I should point out that the rest of the National Operational Guidance also hadn't had an equality impact assessment, and that's a fair challenge. I do understand that in later equality impact assessments, the results came out neutral.
Right. Did anybody raise the lack of an equality impact assessment with you at the time, i.e. August 2015?
Danny had mentioned it in discussions, but not formally.
Would it have been feasible to carry out such an assessment relating to the DCP?
Yes.
And would that have enabled it to be included in the National Operational Guidance, or rather included in the LFB's response to it?
If that would be what AC Cotton would have required to enable that, then yes.
Can you offer any reason yourself, from your own knowledge, as to why she did not?
No, I cannot.
Do you have yourself any view as to whether the DCP was in fact likely to be, as she puts it, inaccessible for individuals with learning difficulties?
I do have a view. It's something that I discussed with Professor Honey. He'd made further inquiries at Cardiff University with those who specifically research into neurodiversity and in particular dyslexia, and the feedback was that for people, in particular those with dyslexia, having some kind of scaffolding to support a decision-making process would actually be beneficial as opposed to inhibitory.
Yes. Mr. Chairman, I've got one short document I would just like to show the witness on this very topic.
Yep,
and then
right.
it'll be a convenient moment for a break.
Yes.
If that's convenient. Can we please go to LFB 00110677? This is an email from you to Steve Apter, who was Director of Safety and Assurance, dated the 10th of July 2017. So this is, I think, after the Grenfell Tower fire. And you sent him a report, rather a briefing note, in that email in relation to the scheduled DMM policy review. And you say in the second sentence, I've been liaising closely with Rachel, NOG implementation lead, who would greatly encourage the DMM review to reflect NOG. There are additional ramifications in terms of scenario development to be held on MDTs, mobile data terminals, which are produced by NOG in the format of the decision control process. This element alone is likely to outweigh the challenges of implementation of the DCP and make its consideration worthwhile. I'll pop a hard copy on your desk as well. Now, I think that document is a report that you prepared for him, Steve Apter, in July 2017, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
Summarising it, is it right to say that Professor Honey, who had worked with you on both pieces of the research that we've seen already, had actually been consulted on the impact of the DCP on decision-making by commanders with dyslexia?
Had been consulted by commanders with dyslexia.
About commanders with dyslexia?
Yes, I consulted with Professor Honey.
Yes, and he considered that the DCP would enhance, but actually, I think you provide a scaffolding, enhance decision-making in such commanders.
I think that was his wording, yes.
Yes, and presumably, is this right, you agreed with that decision?
Yes.
Well, that conclusion. Could you just tell us briefly why?
Why it would provide the scaffolding, or why it would support, or why I agreed with it?
All three.
All three. So from the perspective of providing some scaffolding, it provides an opportunity to consider the information that's coming in a way that's quite structured and quite formulated. So it would act as a prompt. So from my perspective, that would assist people, whether they have neurodiversity or not. Professor Honey contacted other experts at Cardiff University to seek a view as well. So given the work that he'd done and the consultation that he had, I had no reason to doubt that.
And what was the upshot of your provision of your briefing note about this to Steve Apter?
My understanding is that Steve Apter then took that forward in a report to the Corporate Management Board that proposed to implement the decision control process in LFB subject to a full EIA.
And we'll, I think, return to that after the break, if we may.
Certainly.
Mr. Chairman, is that okay?
Yes, well, thank you. Well, before we do have the break, can you just tell me what you mean or what you're referring to when you talk about scenario development to be held on MDTs? MDTs are the mobile data terminals, aren't they?
Yes.
Which are carried on the appliances. What are you referring to, scenario development held on MDTs?
As part of the National Operational Guidance Programme, in addition to the guidance itself, the policy itself, the team were also producing some tools that might be useful to fire and rescue services. Some of those were training specifications. These in particular were scenario templates that would be held on the mobile data terminals that effectively would provide risk information to fire and rescue services about the particular incident type that they're going to. So for an incident commander, they would be en route to an incident, they could press a button on the mobile data terminal, and in front of them they'd be able to see risks that might be typically associated with that incident or the particular premises itself. Might be information about likely elements of a plan or policy that they may wish to consider, and that was structured using the decision control process to really help again to embed the use of those decision controls, as we explained, providing an additional prompt. They are published on the National Operational Guidance Programme website, and if it helps the inquiry, I can provide a link to signpost that.
All right, thank you very much. Well, I think at that point we'll take the morning break. So we'll stop there and we'll resume, please, at 20 to 12. And as before, please don't discuss your evidence or anything relating to it with anyone while you're away. All right?
Certainly.
Thank you very much. We'd like to go to the usher then, please. Thank you. 20 to 12, please. Would you ask Dr. Cohen Hatton to come back in, please? Yeah, please do, yes.
Thank you.
All right, ready to carry on?
I am.
Good, thank you.
Yes. We were on LFB 00110677. We looked at page 1, which was the email. Attached to the email was the briefing note. And if we can go to page 4 in that briefing note, Dr. Cohen Hatton, you'll see that there's a heading, Dyslexia Expert Comments. Professor Honey, School of Psychology, Cardiff University, was consulted over the impact of the DCP on decision-making in commanders with dyslexia, and he reported, and I'll just read this to you, there's a strong relationship between dyslexia and problems with executive functioning at both children, Varvara, and adults, Brosnan, Smith, Spark. Executive functioning is a general term for the capacity to control, monitor, and change behaviours when needed, and to plan future behaviour when faced with novel tasks and situations. Executive functions are central to decision-making in everyday life. The provision of additional support and scaffolding for decision processes should be of particular value to firefighters and incident commanders with dyslexia, as well as others who have atypical executive function. The provision of effective information about when to use decision controls should enable engagement with the modified decision-making guidance, which should in turn enhance decision-making. That, I think, is where we see the use of the word scaffolding, which I think you referred to before.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, did you bring this argument here, this relationship identified in the academic literature, to the attention of A.C. Cotton in order to support your view that the DCP should be adopted?
Not directly. By the time we had this, I think she was already commissioner, and Steve Apter was the director of assurance, safety and assurance. So it was Steve Apter that I brought this to his attention.
And what did he make of it?
I provided the whole document to him. We didn't talk about this piece specifically, rather we talked about the document in its entirety, and he then went on to take a paper recommending the implementation of the decision control process.
Now, let's go to your statement, please, and go to page 14 at the foot of the page. I'd like to look at paragraph 55 with you. And this is under the heading, Training of Incident Commanders. And you say at the very foot of the page, nevertheless, A.C. Cotton agreed that I could present the concept of decision controls to Babcock and refer to it during discussions around decisions made during training. However, this was not a full implementation of the DCP into training. Now, that was in the context, I think, of your role on the Incident Command Project Board, was it?
That's correct.
Right. We've seen that was responsible for overseeing Babcock's review of the Incident Command training.
It was assisting the review. I didn't have direct responsibility for the review in its entirety.
No, but the Incident Command Project Board did, I think.
That's correct.
Yes. Now, you, I think, exhibit a set of minutes of a meeting of this board on the 2nd of February 2016. Can we go to that? LFB 00110669. And we can see, just taking it from the top, it's a note of the February Incident Command Review Project Board meeting, 2nd of February 2016. Present LFB, Danny Cotton and you, as well as Graham Ellis, Rachel Weatheridge and Laurie Kenny. I think she's the Rachel described in, or referred to in the emails.
Yes, that's correct, although she was occupying a different position.
Yes.
When I referred to her in the email.
Yes, indeed. Now, can we go to page 2? In the top box, third paragraph from the bottom, you can see there that there is a reference to your attendance at a pilot that you observed on the 26th of January. It's just under the second set of red text. SCH, that's you, added the following feedback with regard to the pilot she observed on 26th January. Yes? Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Yes. And then there is some bullet points there. And can we just look at the last, or rather the second bullet point? Decision controls, that the trainers weren't using decision controls. It was discussed that with reference to the decision controls, trainers would benefit from some further input on this subject and how best it can be implemented into the training. Is that what prompted your discussion with Danny Cotton? Or had Babcock already been instructed to incorporate DCP into the training by this time?
No, it didn't prompt my conversation with Danny Cotton. That was some time prior. This was in relation to a previous board where, as I said earlier, Danny had agreed, AC Cotton, forgive me, had agreed that Babcock could use the decision controls as a tool during training, but wasn't going to progress to the full implementation of the decision control process. I went to observe the training and I saw that they weren't using the decision controls to prompt their discussions with incident commanders when they were pausing and doing the coaching work through the decisions.
Was the upshot that somebody, perhaps you, should go back to Babcock and tell or teach Babcock how to insert the DCP training into their incident command training?
I did, and I should be explicit. It was the decision controls specifically rather than the full DCP. I just don't want to get that point confused. So those the three prompts as the technique, as opposed to the full diagrammatic that you will have seen earlier.
Right. So this was. Is it right, therefore, a very scaled down modification to existing training on the decision-making model?
It's the introduction of just the technique. So yes, a very scaled down. Actually, what I would say, rather than a very scaled down version, is it was explicitly just the use of those three prompts.
At what point in the linear normative approach?
It wouldn't. So it wasn't inserted into the decision-making model. This was simply an opportunity for trainers to use those as a prompt, in the same way that I explained earlier on about a monitoring officer might wish to use these as prompts to explore a decision. When the trainers were training incident commanders, they would pause at particular points where decisions were being made, and they might coach an incident commander through those decisions and explore the basis for those decisions. It was there that I suggested the use of the decision controls might be a helpful addition to exploring those decisions. Following this incident command project board, I did arrange to visit Babcock and to present to all of the incident command trainers. I presented the decision controls, their background, what they do when you use them, and I showed them a version of the training that we used when we were conducting the experiment, the second study that we discussed earlier on, to try to show Babcock how their trainers could practically use them throughout the course of their training.
Yes. Now, in fact, I think we can see that to some extent in this meeting minute. If we go to page 3, please. If we go to the bottom box on page 3, fit to train and human factors, trainer training updates, and you can see the second item down, human factors training. Now, Danny Cotton, in her witness statement, we don't need to go to it, but just for reference purposes, it's page 7, paragraph 35. She says that the human factors training there related to the DCP, the decision control process, as a human or as human factors impact decision making, and that it was agreed that you could present to Babcock on that topic. It sounds from what you've just told us is that is correct.
Yes.
Yes. Do you remember if you actually delivered such a presentation to Babcock?
I did.
You did. And how soon after this meeting did you do that? Do you remember?
Due to the passage of time, I can't recall, but I would imagine a record would be on the system somewhere.
Did you continue to monitor whether Babcock trainers were making use of that element of the DCP in their incident command training?
Yes.
After you visited them?
Yes, there were officers that had visited, and I had asked them whether they were using them or not, and the feedback that I'd had suggested that they weren't. I believe that was picked up in another set of Incident Command Project Board notes.
Yes, and we'll maybe come to that in a moment. Just to get back on an answer that you gave earlier on, you said that it was a series of prompts. At what point would the trainers, or were the trainers supposed to use the prompts or deploy them in the otherwise normative linear process?
It wasn't in the normalised linear process. It was a technique in that capacity, and I think this was the challenge of doing it in the way that was suggested. The they would pause at particular points in which a decision was required, and it was at that point they would just coach commanders through those three prompts, as opposed to using the full decision control process itself. Yesterday, when we discussed my evidence, one of the points that you asked me was whether incident commanders were actually using that very linear process. And the point that we settled on was it's very difficult to observe people using that very linear process. So it's difficult to know whether they're actually using that in practice. I think that the point with this is you would get to a decision point, and rather than running through the decision-making model, they were pausing at that point and then exploring the basis for the decision.
Did you form a view at the time about whether that was effective?
My view is it's not sufficient, and I think I pointed that out both in the meeting and in my witness statement, that it doesn't fully account for the full implementation of the decision control process in its entirety. Also, we made the point in the National Operational Guidance that it's important for the decision control process to be well embedded and for those techniques to be well practiced. So experiencing some form of coaching at one training course per year, I would argue, wouldn't be sufficient to make a significant difference in terms of the use of those decision controls during the course of your everyday command experience. I should point out also, for clarity here, the human factors training, as this relates to, was an additional piece of training that was included as a requirement under Fit to Train, where incident command trainers underwent a formal course in human factors delivered by an external agency with expertise in human factors to help incident command trainers to develop an awareness of those additional human factors, or in our sector, the command skills, as we term them, to understand how they might be being applied in practice, so to help to coach people to understand how they're effectively used at an incident.
Did that happen? Did you send the trainers off to be trained about the human factors?
They did. A training provider came in rather than them going off. So yes, they were trained, and the feedback was positive.
Right.
There was a discussion, and I think actually it's in the next paragraph down, that it might be helpful for some LFB officers to also join in some of the additional slots in that, because it was a very helpful example.
I see. So in a nutshell, is it right that the upshot of all of this was that Babcock or Babcock trainers received some training on human factors and the use of DCP prompts?
Yes, they did, yes.
Right.
That's correct.
But otherwise, incident commanders were being trained by Babcock on the DMM as it stood?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, can we go to LFB 00110672? And can we go in that email run to page 2? And it's an email, in fact, it's a post, I think, in a format I'm not sure I'm entirely familiar with, but never mind. It's a post of the 5th of May 2017 from Lee Drawbridge, who is sending an email to the NFCC's National Command and Control User Group. That's NCCUG, yes?
That's correct.
Yes, and you've exhibited it to your statement, which is why I'm asking you about it. Now, it confirms, I think, that the LFB were not intending at that stage to incorporate the DCP into the Brigade's policy and training. And if we look at the second paragraph in this email, he says this: at present, LFB have made a strategic decision not to move away from the decision-making model, DMM, as it is felt that there is insufficient evidence to support this when balanced against the business change implications. We looked at this earlier when we were discussing AC Cotton's reasons given to you for not adopting the DCP, and you referred to business implications. Do you know what is meant there by business change implications?
My understanding would be this was in relation to changing the policy itself, changing the training. There was also a view at one point that the decision-making model was used by other groups in London Fire Brigade to make decisions in non-operational circumstances, so support services, for example. There was, at one point, a meeting of a working group that I was invited to, and I don't know if there are any further meetings of this working group. It was the only one that I was invited to, where that question was explicitly asked of the heads of functions of support group, and they confirmed that nobody else, or certainly no one that was represented in that room at the time, were also using the decision-making model, so a move away from it wouldn't pose a challenge to them. So I'm not sure whether in this email, when he's talking about the business change implications, it's also a reference to the belief that other parts of the organisation might also be using the decision-making model.
I see. So just to summarise, I think what you've just said, there wasn't actually any argument for business change implications because the non-operational side of LFB wasn't using the DMM anyway.
I think there was a belief that it would be more difficult to move away from the decision-making model because it was well established in London Fire Brigade.
Yes.
So I think that I think that officers had genuinely believed that, although given that other fire and rescue services had all moved away from the DMM quite successfully, I think that there's a lot of learning that could be sought from others who had already made the move as to how that might practically be done.
Right. I'm just interested in the use of the word business there. You exhibited this email, but how did you understand the word business in that context? Does that imply some sort of budgetary or commercial implication?
No, I think in that context, my understanding is that relates to organisational change more broadly.
Right. Why is the word business used?
I don't know.
Now, the email goes on to say in the next paragraph, the DMM has served us well since implication and has been used at many hundreds of thousands of incidents supporting millions of command decisions. In fact, the only time it's been found not to work, when subject to our rigorous incident review processes, is when it hasn't been applied properly, which is obviously a training implication. The model has also stood up to legal scrutiny at a number of high-profile cases. In relation to the comment about the LFB having found that the only time the DMM didn't work when it wasn't applied properly, that's what he says. Was that consistent with your understanding as at May 2017?
No, I think many fire and rescue services would have also said that the decision-making model was well embedded and was working well. And it wasn't until we undertook the research to actually explore how decisions were being made that we identified some of the issues with the way that decisions were being made that prompted us to move away from that. So it wasn't the case for me that I'd seen that the only time when it doesn't work is when it hadn't been applied properly, because as we found during the research, actually it wasn't reflecting the way that incident commanders were making decisions at all. In fact, it neglected an entire decision-making pathway.
Now, you say that's in the context of your academic work, but I think it's also right that you had experience as head of the Brigade's operational review team. Did you also form a view about whether what Lee Drawbridge is saying here derived from your experience of reviewing operational performance as head of the Brigade's ORT?
Well, I should point out that I didn't take responsibility for ORT until the beginning of June, about 2 weeks prior to the fire at Grenfell. This email was sent on the 5th of May, so this was sent prior to my experience there. But if I could perhaps help by sharing my experience after that and the recognition that it wasn't the case at this point in time. I wouldn't support that. I think that people were making decisions as we'd outlined earlier, sometimes analytically, more often than not, very reflexively. And I don't consider that to be a fault with the application of the decision-making model, because I think the reality is people will make a decision using one of those pathways depending on their previous experience, depending on the pressures that they're experiencing at the time, depending on the situation in front of them. as opposed to simply telling them that they should make a decision in a particular way with no tools or techniques to assist them in doing that.
Right.
So
you
that, sorry.
I'm sorry, I cut you off at the end of your last answer.
No, I was just going to summarise by saying that's not a position that I would agree with.
Right, and that disagreement is derived, am I right, from two things. First, your academic work, your experiments and your findings as recorded in the academic literature, and secondly, your experience after June 2017 as head of ORT.
Yes, and also my experience operationally at London Fire Brigade from the time that I joined in February 2015. So it wouldn't be limited to my exposure there as the head of ORT.
Now, in the next paragraph, Lee Drawbridge goes on as follows. However, we do acknowledge that the DMM could be improved to take account of recent doctrine changes and to improve understanding. We have therefore developed the attached diagram with descriptors to help our incident commanders understand requirements. This has been through our internal operational staff engagement process and has received good feedback, so I'm happy to share it to inform user group discussion. Now, the diagram to which he's referring is at LFB 00122-959. Are you familiar with this diagram?
Only as it was shared through that command and control user group post, which I accessed.
Right. Were you asked to provide any feedback on this diagram?
No, I wasn't.
Were you aware that it had been, it appears, consulted on through the internal operational staff engagement process?
No, I wasn't.
Was the process that's reflected in this diagram, in your view, an improvement on the DMM in any way?
I found this to be quite overly complex. Forgive me, complex. It's positive that the decision controls are included in there. That's, of course, a positive step. But I don't think that just simply the insertion in that particular way would improve the decision-making model in the way that the move to the decision control process might.
And just to help me, please, where do we see the decision control elements?
If you look at the gathering and thinking box on
Right.
the slightly left
I
of
see.
centre,
There.
they're just at the bottom.
They actually fall out of the bottom of the yellow box.
Yes, that's correct.
Can you explain why you were not consulted on this document or the wisdom of adopting it?
No, I cannot. I'd made my position on the belief that the decision control process was an appropriate step forward, very clear, and it was also made clear to me that that was disagreed with. So I cannot say specifically why I wasn't consulted on it.
Ought you to have been, given your place in the structure?
I would have welcomed it, yes.
Well, that may be, but ought you to have been, given your place in the structure?
At that particular point in time, my place in the structure was the DAC in the northwest area. So there would be nothing formally in my position that would have given me any authority or accountability over incident command policy. So it could be argued that no, but it would have been a professional courtesy given my experience with the National Operational Guidance Programme and the development of the decision control process.
Yeah.
And I think I might have been able to assist.
Now, as you tell us in your statement at paragraph 48, and as you've just told us now, you became head of ORT in June 2017, just before the fire at Grenfell Tower. And you, I think, have referred to a paper that you drafted for Steve Apter in relation to the scheduled policy review for the DMM. Let's look at that. That's at LFB 00110677. And if we go to page 12, no, I'm so sorry, there is no page 12. We go to page 2. Is this the paper?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, we looked at page 4 of this earlier on when we looked at the dyslexia element of it. If we go, we can see that the date is the 6th of July 2017, so it's a month or so after you took over.
Yes, that's
as
correct.
head of ORT. If we go to page 2, can we go to paragraph 2? And you'll see there research and findings. 2 pieces of research were conducted, and you set out there, in summary, the summary of your findings of your earlier research in paragraphs 2 and 3, I think.
Yes.
Yes. And at page 3, you can see there's a heading, Benefits, which starts at paragraph 5. And am I right that from paragraphs 5 down to 14, you can't quite see it on the screen, but it's towards the foot of the page, you've set out under a number of subheadings the benefits of incorporating the DCP into policy. And the subheadings are, if one just scrolls up a little bit, national alignment, interoperability, anticipated inspection, equality impact assessment, and then the last one, at the very foot of your screen, risk aversion and operational discretion. If you go to paragraphs 10 and 11 there, under anticipated inspection, you suggest there that the LFB could be inspected on the basis of energy compliance, and in relation to the EIA, you say that the DCP should in fact assist those with dyslexia, and you point to an anticipated reduction in risk aversion and uncertainty. And we've looked, as I say, at page 4 specifically on Professor Honey's quoted views about that issue. What was Steve Apter's response to this paper?
It was positive. Sorry, forgive me.
Continue, sorry.
No, it was he responded positively and said that he intended to use this draft to inform a paper that he would take to CMB.
Do you know what he did with this report?
My understanding is that he did indeed draft a report that he took to CMB.
Were you party to any further discussions about the DCP before you began your secondment at the Inspectorate in November 2017?
Perhaps informally with Steve Apter, I would imagine. Due to the passage of time, I can't recall precisely which conversations I may, or who else I may have had a conversation with, but it was broadly Steve Apter. I had also had a conversation with Rachel Weatheridge when I was preparing for this, particularly because there are aspects I think we talked about in national alignment around the development of the scenarios. But I don't recall whether I would have had a follow-on conversation just to get an update on where they were with that. But this was broadly the crux of that was broadly the crux of the discussion with Steve Apter.
And do you know whether Steve Apter did in fact draft a report to take to the CMB?
Yes, I believe he did.
And do you know what the CMB's reaction to it was?
I believe they approved it, subject to an equality impact assessment.
Did that take place, do you know?
I don't know.
Now, is it right that by the time you left the LFB, the DCP had not been incorporated into policy?
Yes, that's correct.
Do you understand why that was?
I believe that Steve Apter would have taken, as I recall, I think the report went to CMB after I'd left.
Yes. Do you know why the DCP had not been incorporated into policy thereafter?
No, I don't.
No. Now, one observation that was made in the Inspectorate's report, in their report following their 2018 inspection of the LFB, was that the Brigade is generally slow to implement organisational change. That is, if we need a reference in the report at SMC 6011, page 23, in the third paragraph from the bottom, but I don't need to take you to that. Is that consistent with your experience of the Brigade's attitude to organisational change when you were there?
I think there are complexities with the structure in London Fire Brigade that can make it more difficult to implement change.
What kind of complexities?
For example, if you want to implement any kind of change in London Fire Brigade, it requires agreement from various heads of service who all have perhaps a narrower remit than you might find in another organisation. But the depth of that remit is very great. So they're responsible for a great deal, but in a very narrow range. Therefore, any kind of significant organisational change will, by its very nature, cross various boundaries. In London Fire Brigade, because of that structure, it does require approval and agreement from a broad range of people who might all have responsibility for a small component of that change, which is necessary to make it happen.
Now, I think you referred yesterday to cultural aspects of the LFB, but your answer just now gave a reason based on its structure.
Yes, I think they're both reasons. The structural reasons definitely impacted. There is a culture in London that is very conservative, and I think that's correct. I think there is great comfort in that is familiar, because it's seen as tried and tested.
What's wrong with that?
Tried and tested is fine, but if there are improvements or change, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got.
But it may be that those who are apparently reluctant to change are simply waiting to be convinced that the change is worth doing.
That may be so.
I mean, sometimes you do have to examine the proposed change quite carefully, don't you?
That's true.
And did you see examples of that within the LFB?
Change was definitely considered very carefully, but I think one of the more challenging elements was the structure, meaning more people would need to agree to a change before that was actually implemented.
And the more people who have to agree, the greater the chance of someone digging his heels in.
Or her, correct.
Or, well, all right, him or her, of course.
Correct.
Yes, Mr. Willett.
Can we go to INQ 30144795, please? This is the Inspectorate's report of February 2021, this year, following their most recent inspection of the LFB. And you can see the first page there on the screen. Can we go to page 31, please, in this document? And at the top of the page there, you can see that they deal with the incident command decision model. And the report says this: the Brigade is the only fire and rescue service in England not to use the National Incident Command Decision Model. We raised this in our 2019 inspection as an area for improvement. The Brigade has reviewed the model it currently uses and compared it with the national model used by all other services. An option favoured by several of the senior leaders we spoke to is to have an updated model that combines elements of both the national and Brigade models. A decision has yet to be made about which option to select. Whatever model the Brigade finally chooses to use must either be in line with or better than the national guidance. The Brigade will need to quickly assure itself of its choice because it will be part of the planned incident command training. Now, this report came, of course, given the date after you'd left the Brigade in September 2019 to go to West Sussex. Do you have any knowledge of what the Inspectorate had said was apparently under consideration at the Brigade?
Not at that particular point in time. I believe latterly there was a report that was published that suggested a hybrid model, but that report was published quite recently, I understand, in the last few months. I'm not cited on whether that was implemented.
Right. And have your views been sought about whether a hybrid would work?
No.
Would they work? Or would it work?
I think the introduction of the decision controls is, of course, a welcome step. I think there are some challenges with a hybrid model, not least the change in terminology. So one of the points that we saw in the paper that I produced for Steve Apter earlier on was that point about intraoperability and, of course, interoperability. It's important when you are dealing with incidents, particularly incidents that cross borders, and particularly incidents that involve decision makers from other fire and rescue services, that you have the same expectations and the same language. I articulated earlier on in my evidence how there are differences between the language used in the London decision-making model, particularly under the plan formulation element, which was just simply objectives in the London decision-making model, whereas in the National Operational Guidance, that's broken down further, so that you have objectives, you have your operational tactics, and you also have your tactical priorities. So there are differences. The other point, I think, that's important to note is the difference that I pointed out earlier on with the decision control process, being able to essentially show that you can make decisions in both ways, so recognising the two pathways, the one being a very analytical pathway, including that plan formulation, but also then accounting for the other decision-making process, the more intuitive decision-making process. That wouldn't be accounted for Unless, sorry, that was accounted for in a hybrid model, that would be another potential disparity. And when I'm talking about a hybrid model, I'm referring to the version that we saw earlier on appended to Lee Drawbridge's post to the National Command and Control User Group, just for clarity for the inquiry. And the final point is one of the active monitoring, which again I signposted earlier on in my evidence, because in the decision-making model, all you have is the loop at the end suggesting that you should evaluate once you've gone through that linear process, so only the analytical process that's recognised, as opposed to consistently scanning your environment and actively monitoring your environment for any kind of change that might inform your situational assessment.
Right. Looking at the first sentence of the first paragraph on the screen, Dr. Cohen Hatton, was there anything special about London that would justify this kind of exceptionalism when it came to the decision-making model?
Not that I could reasonably propose.
What was the justification within the LFB for not towing the national line established by the NOG?
Mainly around the points that we discussed earlier, so the business change element that Lee Drawbridge pointed to in his evidence. The equality impact assessment was one of the other reasons that was given.
Right. Did anybody, to your knowledge, analyse those reasons critically to see if they were well-founded?
There was nothing that I was cited on that said that that piece of work has been done. However, it may have been. There was, as we've already established, there were several papers that were relevant that I wasn't cited on at the time either. So I'm reluctant to give a definitive answer to that in case there are papers that I'm not aware of.
Now, I'm going to turn to a different subject. It's still in the sphere of incident command, but I'd like to explore with you how LFB's consideration of your research and the decision control process fitted into its consideration of incident command more generally following the Lakenal House Coroner's Rule 43 recommendations. Now, of course, the recommendations came before you joined the Brigade. The date of the letter is the 28th of March 2013. First, do you agree that the Lakenal Coroner's recommendations formed part of the literature that was considered during the development of the Incident Command National Operational Guidance?
Yes, it was.
It was. If we could look at the coroner's recommendations then, that they are at LFB 000-32158. The first page is, I hope by now very familiar to everybody, 28th of March 2013, to Ron Dobson, the then Commissioner. And if you turn, please, to page 2, you can see at the foot of the page that the second and the third group of recommendations relates to incident command. And it says this: during the Lakenal House fire, there were 6 changes of incident commander, IC, with some serving as IC for brief periods. It is recommended that the Brigade review its policy and procedures concerning incident command, having regard to whether it is effective for the choice of IC to be tied closely to the number or type of appliances attending an incident, and the effectiveness of a policy which may result in rapid and frequent changes of IC. It is also recommended that consideration be given to training of ICs and potential ICs to enhance their performance in relation to the following, and there are 7 bullet points set out as areas for training review. Now, the first one reads as follows: use of the dynamic risk management model and other management tools to enable ICs to analyse the situation and to recognise and react quickly to changing circumstances. Did you understand from the time you joined the LFB, well, let me ask this question, when you joined the LFB, did you see this document?
Not this document, no.
Did anybody ever bring this document to your attention and tell you that the Lakenal House Coroner had made this recommendation?
No, but I was familiar with the recommendations from the Lakenal House Inquiry because it was included in the literature review for the National Operational Guidance.
Yes.
So some of the work packages that we developed were based on recommendations, not just from Lacanau, but more broadly with other critical incidents also.
And how closely involved were you with the production of the material which went to Gary Reason in April 2013, from which he then oversaw the process of carrying the recommendations forward?
I'm afraid I don't know what material that was.
Right. So I think the answer is you weren't.
Yes.
Yes. Now, looking at the reference to other management tools, did you ever come to understand that that would include the decision control process or the dynamic, the DMM, the decision-making model, or other policies?
An element of this was part of the driver to develop those techniques. The coroner here makes reference to tools to help incident commanders to analyse the situation and to recognise and react quickly to changing circumstances. As I explained earlier, one of the core parts of the decision controls themselves was aimed at improving situational awareness and helping incident commanders to move past the point of simply seeing a situation, recognising a situation in a here and now, and moving to the point where they would essentially be anticipating what might happen next, which is that highest level of situational awareness.
To your knowledge, did anybody ever revisit the recommendations made by the coroner to consider training of ICs and potential ICs to enhance their performance in the use of these models when deciding not to adopt the decision control process?
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that.
Right. To your knowledge, did it ever come up in any discussions to which you were a party?
Nothing that I was cited on.
Right. Did anybody ever, to your knowledge, consider that there was a risk that if rejected, the LFB might not be carrying into effect that aspect of the Lacanau House coroner's recommendation?
Not explicitly, but I had pointed out previously that the work that we did in the National Operational Guidance was based on the literature review, which took learning from a range of critical incidents.
Yes. Now, I think it's right that the training package that the Brigade eventually developed in response to the Coroner's Rule 43 recommendations on incident command training was called Wholecroft House. Is that familiar to you?
No.
Not. Can I just look then briefly, we'll take this quickly, at the Wholecroft House Exercise Trainer Guide. It's a BAB 6011, and the document is, although it's undated, is a crew and watch manager training exercise, and it makes no mention at all of the decisions control process. In fact, if you go to page 48, we can be clearer. At paragraph 1.27, it refers to the decision-making model, and there it is. And you can see the process in the text and in the diagram underneath it. Does this tell us that this is basically the LFB's decision-making model embedded in this training?
Yes, it is.
Right. Do you have any knowledge of whether any consideration was given during the development of this package about whether it would be more appropriate to incorporate the decision control process into it?
No, I don't. Babcock will only develop training based on extant policy in London Fire Brigade, is my understanding. So if the decision-making model was the extant policy at the time, that would be the element they would incorporate into their training.
Mm. And do I take it from all of this that you had no involvement at all and you were not consulted on the content of the TCAP that gave rise to this training guide?
I don't know when this training guide was produced.
Well, I think eventually in 2016.
Not that I can recall directly being involved with.
Right. I'd like to turn to a completely different topic now, and that is revalidation of incident command. Can we go to page 17 of your statement, please, and let's look together at paragraph 62. You have a heading above it, revalidation of incident command at the LFB, and you say there, it was proposed that the LFB should introduce a process whereby incident commanders' competencies were revalidated to ensure that they had sufficient operational knowledge and experience to respond competently at incidents. As head of development, I was responsible for reporting to the CMB on the progress of the implementation of a process for revalidation. I've set out my knowledge of the status of the implementation below. Now, to be clear, when you refer to revalidation, am I right that that is essentially a process of continuing assessment?
Yes, in the context, it was broader than a continuous assessment. So the point with revalidation is it's something that should be done once someone has proved competent in role. So that process of becoming competent from their development phase is a separate process. So if I may park that for a second, revalidation was partly the continuous assessment element, but it also incorporated additional opportunities to practice incident command with the setting of a minimum number of hours per annum that someone should have an opportunity to practice incident command. Along with that, one of the proposals was to have an annual schedule of CPD. So you're correct in your assertion that it was a process of continuous assessment, but there were additional pieces included within that should serve to help incident commanders feel confident in the application of their skills rather than just proving competent through an assessment process.
So continuous assessment plus development.
Yes.
And would I be right that this would be assessment in the sense of a pass or fail evaluation, which would ensure that those who don't demonstrate the required level of skill are not able to continue to act as incident commanders?
Yes, that was the initial proposition. Latterly, after a change of Director of Operations, the direction was given that it should be more it should inform a training needs analysis more rather than being as pass and fail as it was initially.
Maybe we're going to come to this, so if we are, I apologise for breaking it at this point and asking the question, but my understanding from evidence we heard on the previous occasions is that the incident commander is determined essentially by the number of pumps that respond to an incident. So the first incident commander would almost invariably be a watch manager.
Or a crew manager, potentially.
Or even a crew manager, all right. And then if he needs to call in more pumps, then the next level up will be a station manager.
Yes, if he or she needed to call in more pumps, it would be a station manager.
Right.
Or station commander.
So how does the revalidation work? Let's assume you have a watch manager who, for one reason or another, isn't revalidated. Does he or she cease to be a watch manager? Or is there a different arrangement for denoting someone as incident commander when 2 or 3 appliances are sent out?
Within the policy, the draft policy itself, we set out some of the criteria that would be applied to determine whether someone was revalidated or not. If someone didn't pass the revalidation, there are a number of steps that were involved in that. Part of that could be to remove that person from operational duties should they not meet the criteria to be revalidated. So they wouldn't be at that incident necessarily. It would be someone else that would be attending.
So no one was at risk of being reduced in rank?
No.
To prevent being, as it were, put in as incident commander because of the number of pumps responding?
No, they wouldn't be reduced in rank. The rank would also encompass the activity that they would foreseeably do as their part of their day job, their day-to-day managerial role. But what could happen, as is set out in the draft policy, is they could be removed from operational duties, or a number of steps were suggested that could also provide additional assurances to the service, like a process called tagging, where an additional officer would be sent to that incident as well to support them and provide an additional level of assurance. It could be an additional training course, some additional enhanced training that person does. Effectively, the draft policy recommended a period where you'd have a 30-day opportunity to improve, and then you would be retested.
Right. Thank you very much.
Is it right to say that during your time at the LFB, there was no system for ongoing or continuous assessment of incident command competence, at least at level 1?
That's correct.
And that would, level 1, I think, is watch manager and station manager.
Yeah, no.
Just watch manager.
Forgive me, crew manager,
and watch manager. Forgive me. Now, the position, I think, is this right, was that incident command competence was assessed at the point of entry into that role.
Yes, that's correct.
So at the point of promotion to crew manager and watch manager.
All of the roles, yes.
All of the roles. And is it right that although there was a system for continuing refresher incident command training, that training didn't include any element of assessment? In other words, individuals who performed poorly could still continue to act as incident commanders.
That's correct.
Can you explain why it was that the LFB sought to introduce this revalidation programme?
Yes, there was a recognition that nationally there was a move to ensuring that incident commanders were continuously assured that they were performing at the appropriate level. A revalidation programme in itself wasn't an entirely new concept. Many other fire and rescue services, as we explored in one of the reports to CMB that's appended to my witness statement, many of the other fire and rescue services were already using some kind of revalidation process. Revalidation in London Fire Brigade was originally proposed under a different project called Ticket to Ride, which was proposed by an officer as part of their executive leadership programme. It was progressed to a point at which the project was proposed and approved, but it wasn't then continued.
And you say officers as part of their executive leadership programme. Was that directed, the Ticket to Ride project, directed at more senior officers?
No, that would have been across the board.
Right. Now, was there any sense, as far as you know, that the lack of a system of continuous assessment was seen to be a problem or some kind of deficiency in the existing system?
The value of it was absolutely recognised. The Commissioner was very keen that CMB oversaw the progress of the revalidation process because it was taken very seriously in London Fire Brigade, and there was a recognition that it was important both organisationally and to individual commanders as well.
Right. Now, before we look in more detail about how that proposed programme of revalidation was progressed, I want to ask you about assessment of incident command competence at the moment of entry into the role during your time. Is it right, first, that the assessment of incident command competence at the point of promotion took place by way of an incident command exercise that happened at a promotional assessment centre?
Yes, that's correct. The incident command exercises would be developed by the operational review team, ORT, and they would be carried out by Babcock, and they would be assessed by LFB officers.
And the exercise is overseen by LFB officers too?
Yes, that's correct.
Did you have any involvement in your capacity as head of development in the development of those assessed incident command exercises?
No, the responsibility and the authority of those was retained by ORT as the effectively the subject matter experts on that.
Right. Did you, when you took over head of ORT, become involved?
I did.
Right. But only for 4 months?
A short period.
Yes, until you were seconded to the constabulary. Right. Did you have any involvement in the assessment of the candidates undertaking the exercises?
I didn't. Oh, yes, I did. I ran the DAC's assessments.
And that meant that you oversaw both the exercise and the assessment?
Yes.
Yeah. And in your experience, were those incident command exercises effective in selecting candidates who had the necessary skills and sets of competence that were needed for incident command?
They were challenging exercises. I think it was important that they were challenging exercises. They were one of the areas that I think that we could have improved on in those was selection against human factors. One of the pieces of work that was progressed nationally was the development of a behavioural marker system for incident command, the THINKS system. That system is designed to assess how effectively those command skills are being used. So the behaviours that might suggest you're effectively generating good situational awareness, for example, or behaviours that might suggest you're making a decision effectively, for example. The assessment process in London Fire Brigade actually mirrored the assessment process in many fire and rescue services at that time, and it was focused on the criteria set out in the National Occupational Standards for incident commanders, namely WM7 for crew managers and watch managers, and EFSM2 for station managers and above. So, in answer to your question, very concisely, the assessment process was aligned with the assessment process broadly undertaken by fire and rescue services nationally, but there were later introductions that are aimed at helping nationally identify how effectively some of the command skills are being used rather than just focusing on the process.
Right. Now, we've already considered in the context of your academic research the importance of plan formulation in relation to decision-making by incident commanders at incidents. Did you have a view at the time you were head of development as to whether those promotional incident command exercises were effective, specifically in assessing the candidates' decision-making processes?
I think the issue was that they weren't able to use anything other than the decision-making model. So whilst it was effective at identifying the outcomes of the decisions that were being made, so the assessment, yes, was able to identify that. The issue was more that you were only basing your judgment based on the decision-making model, which was somewhat limited in comparison.
Right. So does that tell us that they were ineffective because there was a direct link from situational awareness to plan execution without going through the process injected, or which would have been injected by the decision control process?
I think that the assessments themselves only looked at the outcomes of the processes. So I don't think I could say something as simply as they were ineffective. I think that there are elements that were later considered nationally that would enhance that would enhance an assessment of how effective someone was commanding an incident.
Right. I mean, overall, did you think they were effective or ineffective?
They were good.
They were good. How did the exercises then achieve effective plan formulation as well as plan execution if they were only working on the DMM?
So the exercises themselves were designed to run as an incident may run with specific injects at particular times. And I think it's important to separate that from the process by which someone would be making a particular decision. So I think that the assessment criteria themselves just focused on the outcomes. The outcomes that you would see would be more commonly derived from someone seeing a cue in the environment and then responding to that, as opposed to the full consideration of some of the safeguards that might help to support that. The other element that the assessment didn't do, and I hasten to add, nor did assessments elsewhere in fire and rescue services, effectively assess how effective someone's situational awareness was. It didn't look at whether the behaviours that you were seeing would suggest that someone was anticipating what might happen next. They had a high level of situational awareness, or whether it was essentially in the here and now, because it was more focused on the outcomes of things. It was very focused on the process as opposed to how you were going through that process.
And was the absence of any focus on how you were going through that process, in your view at the time, a deficiency in those incident command exercises?
I think we've seen improvements nationally, but I have to say, at the time, it was in step more broadly with what was being done by other fire and rescue services. So it would be difficult to describe it as a deficiency in that capacity because it was broadly similar. The improvements came later.
Right. But the fact that it was in step doesn't necessarily mean that it was effective, does it?
No, that's fair.
So was it effective even though it was in step?
It was effective at identifying the areas that it was set out to identify. I fear it would be an oversimplification to say that it wasn't fully effective.
Now, we've already seen the minutes of the Incident Command Project Board from the 2nd of February 2016. We saw that this morning, which recorded that the trainers observed during an Incident Command training pilot were not using decision controls. You'll remember that was, I think,
Yes.
page 2 of the document. Did the promotional Incident Command exercises specifically incorporate the decision control process at any stage?
No, it didn't.
And why was that?
The exercise itself wouldn't have afforded an opportunity to pause and to explore the decisions that were being made at any point in time. It was effectively run to simulate an incident.
Right. Now, can I then turn to the revalidation programme again and get back to that? Can we go, please, to LFB 00118186? This is a report entitled Revalidation of Incident Command Competence, which was written for the Commissioners Group on the 17th of November 2015, that I think you wrote
I did.
as Head of Development.
That's correct.
Now, in summary, am I right that this report sets out a proposal for implementing a system of incident command revalidation, including a number of different options about what that system would look like?
That's correct.
Now, let's go to page 2. Can we look at paragraph 5, please? You say there that there is a considerable public and legal scrutiny into the way in which incidents are dealt with. Formal scrutiny may come from a number of quarters, including the Health and Safety Executive, fire investigators acting for loss adjusters, as well as judicial inquiries. Scrutiny of command, competence and or command decisions has been applied to fire and rescue services following several high-profile incidents. This includes recent incidents involving firefighter fatalities. And if you look at the footnote 1, it says Harrow Court, Hertfordshire, Marley Farm, East Sussex, 2006, and Atherstone-on-Stour, Warwickshire, 2007, and Balmoral Bar, Strathclyde, 2009. And two of those incidents will be familiar, I think, from earlier evidence. Going on with paragraph 5, it says, and other serious incidents involving deaths of members of the public. And then there's a footnote 2, and that's a reference to the London bombings, Galston mine incident, and Lakenal House, London, 2009. It is important, therefore, that the Brigade can demonstrate that individuals have been adequately prepared and are competent. And if we go to paragraph 6, please, the last sentence says, the implementation of such systems to revalidate command competence varies across the UK, although typically involves a formal assessment every 18 to 24 months. Now, does this mean that the LFB was the exception in not having any system of formal revalidation?
We looked at a number of fire and rescue services, not every fire and rescue service. So it would be unfair of me to say that.
Right. But did you know of any fire and rescue service which, like the LFB, had not developed a programme of formal revalidation assessment?
Not to the best of my knowledge, but there may have been.
Right. But on what you saw, you didn't see one?
All of the fire and rescue services that we contacted did have one.
Right. Now, the report goes on to outline the incident command courses that were in place for the LFB within the LFB at that point. If we go to page 9 and look at page 4, look at paragraph 9. Page 4, paragraph 9, under LFB current practice, it identifies the suite of incident command training courses delivered by Babcock. And then says this, the content and delivery of these courses are currently being considered under the course review process, which seeks to deliver improvements aligned with current LFB policy and national operational guidance. There are currently formalised training courses for levels 1 to 3 of incident command, with options for the delivery of level 4 incident command, currently incident command training being scoped. Currently, the initial level 1 incident command course, LIM, or L1M, I think that must be, is the only course which has an assessable element. However, through the course review process, there is the potential to include additional accessible elements to initial and refresher courses. A breakdown of the training, including the accessible elements, is provided in Appendix 1. Now, level 1 is initial, is this right? Level 2 is intermediate, level 3 is advanced, and level 4 is strategic.
Yes, that's correct.
And so, as well as there being no system for ongoing revalidation of competence, there was also no training at all for level 4 incident commanders. Is that right?
That's correct. Aside from the multi-agency Gold Incident Command course.
The GESIP.
The multi-agency Gold Incident Command course would have incorporated elements of GESIP, but it's a course that's run by the College of Policing that aims at providing skills and training to senior strategic commanders. The gap in London specifically in relation to level 4 were additional complexities with the strategic response arrangements that would have been specific to London that would not have been covered in the multi-agency Gold Incident Command course.
I see. Was the absence of any training at all for level 4 incident commanders, save in the respects you've just identified, a concern to you at the time you wrote this document?
It was clear that it was something that was needed.
Yes, but was it a concern to you that it wasn't in place?
It was certainly something that was needed and something that we were progressing through the Incident Command Project Board.
Now, we saw the 2018 inspection of the LFB done by the Inspectorate, and I think you'll recall maybe that this was a problem picked up in that report, wasn't it?
Yes, I believe so.
If we go to page 40 in that document, that's INQ 30014796. If you go to the penultimate paragraph on that page, it says this: in London, refresher training is only available for level 1, crew manager and watch manager, and level 2, station manager and group manager commanders, and it isn't a formal reassessment of command competence. That is, staff can't fail for poor performance and will therefore return to command incidents. And if you look at the next paragraph, it says, training for level 3 commanders, deputy assistant commissioner and assistant commissioner, isn't consistently in place. Is that consistent with your recollection of level 3 training?
Level 3 training was delivered primarily through something that you might have seen abbreviated as a POEX, which was a principal officer exercise. Those were delivered, my understanding, they were scheduled to occur every other year. It was more an exercise rather than a course with formalised input. I think the issue that I was more concerned with here was the lack of a maintenance of skills programme. The maintenance of skills programme would sit outside of the remit for the training and development department, as you have seen in the structure of London Fire Brigade, and the maintenance of skills programme is owned by the Operations Directorate. It was covered by a policy called DAMOP. It was mainly focused on exercising based on risks in individual boroughs, as opposed to a formalised maintenance of skills schedule that would be applied to all incident commanders. That was something that was outside of the remit of revalidation, which I believe was reported in one of the later reports.
But the absence of skills maintenance is something that was picked up as a concern in this report, at least so far as levels 1 and 2 are concerned.
Yes.
We get that from the penultimate paragraph on that page, don't we?
Yes.
So, and was that consistent with your experience?
Yes.
Yeah. If we go on to the last sentence of the paragraph, at the foot of the page, it says, most level 3 and 4 commanders we spoke to confirmed they hadn't had training for several years. Again, is that consistent with your recollection and experience at the time?
I think it depends on what they're referring to as training. I would be surprised if they hadn't had a principal officer exercise. But again, the point that I think is salient here is that distinction between a principal officer exercise and some formalised input that they might expect to receive on a training course.
Right. Just taking that last sentence at face value, and perhaps leaving on one side the POEX, or Principal Officer Exercise, Was there no system at all for continuing assessment of officers of ranks at levels 3 and 4, following the single assessment they would have undertaken at the point of promotion to that rank?
No, that's correct. That's something that we intended to incorporate through the development of revalidation to rectify that.
Right. So the revalidation programme was designed, at least in part, to address that deficiency. Would that be right?
That's correct.
Right. Now, was it also the case that your concern about the absence of a formal revalidation procedure was aggravated because of a decline in the opportunities that commanders would have had to gain experience at real live incidents?
Yes, that's correct. Traditionally in the Fire and Rescue Service, in the sector as a whole, not exclusively London, there was often a heavy emphasis on gaining experience through exposure to operational incidents. With that decline, whilst of course incredibly positive, there does mean that those incident commanders would be having less exposure and therefore would need more simulation and more training to adequately prepare them for that. It's a point that we had discussed nationally in great depth. And again, I have to make the point that when people are typically passing a judgment on how productive a fire and rescue service is, they are using measures such as the number of home fire safety visits they may do, or the number of fire safety audits they may do, or the number of calls that they might go to. One of the issues that aggravates that then at a fire and rescue service level is that the preparation for going to incidents through training isn't necessarily something that is monitored on a national level through, for example, submissions of data to the Home Office that is then taken into consideration with the productivity of a fire and rescue service. But it is a crucial element.
Right. Can I just ask you something in that last answer? You say that, this is line 17 in the raw transcript, that as a whole, not exclusively London, there was often a heavy emphasis on gaining experience through exposure to operational incidents. Could you just explain how that would manifest itself in London? Why do you say there was a heavy emphasis on gaining experience through going to live incidents? As opposed to what?
As opposed to simulations. I think that nationally, over time, there was an assumption that most people would get a great deal of experience naturally through going to operational incidents. The amount of time that an officer would spend at an operational incident would previously have been much greater because there were more operational incidents. At the moment, we did some work actually for the revalidation process that analysed the amount of time officers at various levels would reasonably have spent at incidents. We took a sample of about 10%, as I recall from memory, of officers at each rank and analysed how long they'd spent in charge of an incident, and it was relatively low.
Yes, well, that is an answer to a question based on a document I haven't yet shown you. Let's go to that, because you did some work on this. LFB 00118186. Now, this is your November 2015 report that we saw earlier. And if we go to page 4, we can see that at paragraph 13 you set out some statistics under the heading operational exposure. And I'll just read the text to you at the beginning. It says this: whilst the attendance rate of officers to incidents has remained relatively unchanged due to the increasing variety of incidents and skills required, there has been a reduction in the number of times officers have been required to undertake the role of incident commander. This means that the opportunity to practice the skills required for incident command under the realistic pressures of an incident have also reduced. See Table 1. This data focused on time in command as opposed to other roles, as this requires specific command skills to be exercised under pressure. Now, I don't think we need the rest of the text. And then you look at Table 1 and you can see, it runs to the foot of the page, you've got the various different levels, the average number of times IC role adopted per annum, and current annual exposure in hours between the years, I think, 2012 to 2015. As you say, the figures were relatively low. Are these the figures that you're referring to?
Yes, they are.
They are. Now, if you go on to the next page of this document, please, paragraphs 14 and 15, you have a heading, Assessable Command Performance Promotional Assessments. If you look at the first sentence of paragraph 14, you say, currently, incident command for officers is assessed on entry to that role through an incident command exercise, ICE, at promotional assessment centres. The average scores of these assessments at the level of SM, GM and DAC over the last 3 assessment centres are set out in Appendix 2. The pass mark is set at 75%. Candidates who achieve between 50% and 75% are considered to require development, and those who score below 50% fail the assessment outright. Now, you then go on to say, to give an indication of the current performance of incident commanders entering these levels over the past 3 assessment centres, 25% of candidates passed the station manager ICE with no development required, 25% of the group passed the group manager ICE, and 36 passed the DAC ICE. It is anticipated that an effective revalidation process with a focus on effective development would see a significant increase in success at assessable command elements. It would provide as an effective guide to readiness for promotion, as well as improving performance on the incident ground in role. Now, are these pass rates very low or relatively low?
The 25%, the 25% and the 36%?
Yes.
I believed that to be low in comparison to the overall numbers going through. I don't have a comparison to offer you with other fire and rescue services, if that's the crux of the question.
That was that was a question, because but you didn't have a metric.
No.
Right. Nonetheless, were these figures a concern to you?
Yes, they were.
Are you able to explain why they were what they were?
I think in this report, one of the points that I make is that the first time these incident commanders are attempting to command an incident of the level or the scale or the complexity that would be expected at that level is when they go into the assessment itself. They didn't have an opportunity to take a development course prior that might prepare them for operating in that kind of environment. It wasn't a pass or fail element at the end of a course, for example. It was a straightforward assessment that you would go into without that prior development. So I think the reason that those pass marks are very low are simply because those commanders haven't had the opportunity to develop and practice at the level at which they are applying for.
Or could it be that you're setting the bar justifiably quite high?
The bar was set appropriately at the level of exercise that you would conceivably be expected to command at that level because of the scale and complexity.
Well, I understand that, but someone's got to judge whether you come up to standard, haven't they?
That's correct.
And that involves setting a standard.
Yes, that's correct.
And if you set your standards high, you're likely to have fewer successful candidates. But is that a cause for concern?
That's true, although I don't think a pass mark of 75% of 3/4 is excessively high, and I don't think that the complexity of the incidents was excessively difficult. I think it adequately reflected the expectations that should be placed on one of those commanders.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
Do you know how it was, or who it was that decided that the pass mark should be 75%?
I believe, and I don't have a document that I could refer to, but I believe from recollection it would have been the Director of Operations that set the pass mark.
And do you know whether the pass mark was based on criteria that were common or used in other fire and rescue services for something analogous?
I don't have an analogy I can draw on, I'm afraid.
Mr. Chairman, we're going to move on in the topic, but come to a different document which has a number of questions attached to it, which I won't complete before 1 o'clock.
Good point to stop, perhaps.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, well, Dr. Cohen, Hatton, it's time we all stop for some lunch, I think, so we'll break off there. We'll resume at 2 o'clock, please.
Certainly.
And again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence over the break.
Of
All
course.
right? Thank you very much. Would you go with the ushers then, please?
Certainly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minute. 2 o'clock.